Welcome everyone to our Reframe and Refresh series hosted by New Day Films. We are really excited to have all of you joining us from around the country. My name is Larissa Lam, and I am a member owner of New Day Films. I also directed a film called Far East Deep South about the early Chinese in Mississippi in the segregated South. And there was very much a story about solidarity between the Asians and the Black community there. And so I'm very excited about today's conversation. We have a very exciting panel today. We have LeeAnn Dance, who is the director of My Dear Children, a powerful film about the pogroms in the early 1900s in Eastern Europe. We have Jon Osaki, the director of Reparations, kind of examining the case for reparations. And we have our esteemed educator, Keisha Rembert, who's going to bring her knowledge and her experience to the table today. So we're very excited to see everyone here, including our panelists. We've got North Carolina, we've got Illinois in the house, we've got Napa. I'm so excited to see all these very varied groups of people in our discussion today. Without further ado, I actually want to bring on a colleague of mine, Pam Sporn, who's going to tell us a little bit more about our sponsor for today, New Day Films.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Pam Sporn, and I have two films in our distribution cooperative. One is Detroit 48202, Conversations Along a Postal Route, and another is With a Stroke of the Chaveta. So New Day Films is a unique filmmaker-run distribution cooperative, providing award-winning films to educators, community groups, government agencies, public libraries, and businesses since 1971. Democratically run by more than 150 filmmaker members, New Day is committed to reflecting greater diversity, representation, and inclusion. New Day films have been broadcast on PBS, HBO, and other media outlets. It's celebrating over 50 years of delivering dynamic and provocative storytelling with filmmakers who have won hundreds of awards, including Emmys and Oscars, including one of our founders, Julia Reichart. So welcome, and we encourage you to put questions in the chat as we move along.
Thank you so much, Pam, for telling us all a little bit more about New Day. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon's discussion, Mike Mascoll. And Mike Mascoll is a director, producer, creative director, and founder of Lev Media Group. His use of storytelling helps to document invaluable stories, invaluable chapters in Black history, lending promise and a restructure to the American consciousness. Mike's first film with New Day, On the Line, highlighted one of the longest voluntary school desegregation programs in the country and its historical impact on the city of Boston. His latest film, Codeswitching, Race and Identity in Suburban Schoolhouse, directed by Jonathan Schwartz, takes an intimate look at the life experiences of 5 generational students and their personal encounters as they investigate self-awareness and cultural boundaries. And it's a wonderfully enlightening film that I also encourage you to check out. Please welcome Mike Mascoll, your moderator for today.
Thank you, Larissa, and thank you to everyone who's on the Zoom for today's event. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to always get together and share our ideas and get a little bit further into what we do. I wanted to take a moment first and just kind of frame the day, because what we're really talking about is radical solidarity. So I wanted to share with you one take real quick, and then I'll get into the introductions of the panelists. In the words of Angela Davis, radical simply means grasping things at the root. Solidarity being the unity that kind of binds people together as one, right? So recognizing that your struggle is my struggle, which is ultimately a shared struggle for survival, decentering our personal interests in favor of, broadening the vision or the thoughts for the collective group, right? So the collective group. I wanted to frame that first as we get into the discussion. And now let me just kind of start with a few introductions of our panelists for today. Starting with LeeAnn Dance. She's a co-producer, director, and writer of My Dear Children, and she is an award-winning television producer and groundbreaking investigative reporter. She has worked as a freelance journalist in East Africa and as a writer and producer at CNN. Since leaving CNN, Dance has taught broadcast journalism at George Mason University and worked as a producer at the U.S. State Department. So welcome, LeeAnn, and glad to meet another member of New Day organization.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Second on the list is Keisha Rembert. Now, she is an assistant professor, DEI coordinator for teacher preparation at National Louis University. She spent more than 15 years teaching middle school English and U.S. history in the Chicago area. And in year 2019, Keisha was named Illinois History Teacher of the Year. Her passion for equity and social justice coalesce in her work with several organizations. She served on the Illinois Holocaust and Genocide Commission and the Educator Advisory Board of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. She's also on the National Council for Teachers of English Committee Against Racism and Bias, as well as the Gilder Lerman Institute for American History Advisory Board. So, Keisha, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. And lastly, I have another colleague within the New Day co-op, Jon Osaki. He's an award-winning filmmaker who has directed and produced promotional, educational, narrative, and documentary films. And his initial interest in film grew from his desire to share the stories of the Japanese Community Youth Council, where he has served as the executive director since 1996. Over the past few years, he has had films screened at film festivals and community events across the country. And as a filmmaker, Jon views this genre as the next step in his lifelong pursuit of social justice and equity. And his film in the co-op is Reparations. Thank you, Jon, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we kind of dive into conversations, though, what I'd like to do, I'd like to start with just kind of showing a preview of one of the first films, My Dear Children. The film is a journey that reveals the heartbreaking and little-known humanitarian tragedy. One of 100 years ago, Jews in what's today known as Ukraine, Moldova, and the Belarus area experienced pogroms that swept the region from 1917 to 1921 and killed some 300,000 Jews. So let's take a look at that trailer first.
And as you see the Cossacks shooting people. Was the common slogan of that time, kill the Jews and save the Russians.
4 or 5 years, constant violence, it becomes normalized. This was just something that people believed that they could do with impunity. In fact, they could do with impunity.
Certain towns that had Jewish populations before the war were completely empty of their populations of Jews, turned into cemeteries. This is a catalog of the pogroms. They have the lists of murdered.
It was the Holocaust of its day.
Trace my grandmother's efforts to escape the pogroms.
So all this neighborhood was Jewish.
And are there any Jewish people left?
Nobody.
Must have been her giving permission to take the children.
This is incredible. Got goosebumps. I always wondered why he had been chosen to be given up for adoption. There was the feeling of having been rejected by his mother.
Her actions as the mother, they were absolutely not logical to us as humans and as mothers.
All these people are gone. So whom to ask questions?
Our dear children, I, your mother, will describe what I have done in this beautiful great world with lots of troubles.
I think she wanted her children to know that she didn't give them up without real heartache of her own.
And it was her way of saying, I want you to understand why I did this. And the only way that you can understand this is if I tell you what life was like.
We overheard them saying that they should kill all the Jewish children so that the Jews would die out.
I think that this little book written by your grandmother has a significant historical value.
She writes about a period that curiously has been underexplored in Jewish history.
The most amazing thing about Vega, not Vega's memoir, but her destiny.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. Mike, you can unmute yourself. Yes, some of the comments in the chat here, it is a very shocking and horrific chapter. LeeAnn, why don't you go ahead and dive into why you decided to make this film?
Sure. So Vega's great grandson is a dear friend of mine, and he brought me a copy of the memoir that had been translated for family members, thinking it would make a great documentary. But when I first read it, I knew nothing about this time period that Vega was talking about, these anti-Jewish pogroms after World War I. I mean, we all know about the Holocaust, but I knew nothing about this period of anti-Jewish violence. And so I had to do a deep dive before I could even begin. But finding scholars who could help me understand this time period was also very, very difficult. And I kept getting punted to another scholar, until finally I landed on a PhD candidate who was writing her dissertation about this exact same time period. And the two of us were sort of shocked to find each other because no one was really exploring this time period. And so she was surprised I was interested, and I was surprised she was interested. So that's how I got into it.
While we're waiting for Mike, I will go ahead and ask the next question in the interest of time, as Mike is having some technical difficulties. So LeeAnn, why do you think so little is known about this period, and what impact did this period of anti-Jewish violence have on the Holocaust?
Well, this was a very chaotic time. It was a civil war in the former Soviet empire, in the Russian Empire, and it was just absolute chaos. And even though there was a plea put out through the Jewish press to try to save these stories as much as possible, so many people were being killed, and there was very little with which to record many of the incidents. In fact, if you go into the archive now, you'll find that the stories that are there are often written on the back of any scrap of paper that could be found. It could be a receipt or, a flyer, and just these things are scribbled on there. But then so many of the other stories were just lost because the entire populations of these little villages were wiped out.
Yeah, and I think Mike might still be having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to move over to Keisha and bring her into this conversation. As an African-American woman, what motivated you to serve on the advisory board of a Holocaust museum?
Really great question, Larissa. And I think there's a two-part answer to that. And the first part is just my parents were storytellers. My parents are from the Jim Crow South. They are survivors of the Jim Crow South who migrated north and always shared their stories with my brother and I, and also always taught us to be empathetic and to listen to story, because story is the basic form of human connection. And when the second part of it is when I visited, when the Illinois Holocaust Museum opened here in the Chicagoland area, I was excited. And when I visited, I got a chance, they have an amazing survivor bureau. And I got a chance to listen to the survivors, and hearing the survivor story, particularly my friend Erin Elster's story, just touched me. And it sounded so much like the stories of my parents and the stories that they had shared. And so this idea of survival and lack of humanity that existed in the Holocaust was very similar to the stories that my mother had told me about chattel slavery in the United States. And so it just, to me, makes sense that I lock arms with people in coalition and solidarity to ensure that it happens never again, that any of it, never again. which is the motto of the museum.
Yeah, no, and I think that definitely feeds into kind of the solidarity we're talking about today, and bringing what on the surface may seem like different groups, but yet there are some common threads throughout history. And for both of you, Keisha and LeeAnn, why is it important, I think, and Jon can jump in here too if you'd like to answer this question, why is it important to talk about Holocaust and pre-Holocaust violence today?
I think we're still otherizing many different groups of people, and that's what motivated me to make this film. I'm not Jewish, and yet I have been impacted by this particular story in a very personal way. But I was once asked, what struck you when making this film? And it's the lack of humanity and the otherization of groups. And I think that's still a problem today. And we certainly saw it, we've seen it with these white nationalist groups marching and, Jews will not replace us. And this is still very relevant.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think back to W.E.B. Du Bois, and he talks about the issue of the color line and this idea of a Black and white binary, and to resist and dismantle racism and all the other isms in our society. I appreciate Jon's film for identifying that when we eradicate and talk about racism, that all of these other isms then are also brought into the fold. But when we have these conversations and when we have solidarity, when we come into community with others who are existing in this dual consciousness, this double consciousness, then we can work in community to eradicate and dismantle the racism that we have seen as all too prevalent today, this very day, for many people across the world.
Well said. I see we have Mike. Mike, you're back? Yes.
Be back.
Yes, you're back. So why don't you go ahead and tell us more about Jon's film and pitch it over to our trailer here.
Right, too, and I want to kind of lead in with the next question for Jon too, but Jon's film Reparations explores a 4-century struggle to seek repair and atonement for slavery in the United States. Black and Asian Americans reflect on this legacy of slavery, the inequalities that persist, and the critical role that solidarity between communities as in acknowledging and addressing systemic racism in America. Jon, I've been fortunate to see your film, and all your films are very powerful. There's a moment in your film, former Congressman Ron Dell's from California, kind of strikes a chord in terms of what solidarity means, and he kind of presented it to Congress from his own personal story. Could you just kind of share that with the audience, and then talk a little bit more about your motivation with the film?
Can we share the trailer first, if you don't mind?
Yeah, please.
You take folks from their native land, their native country, you strip them of every piece of dignity of life, and you make them work, and you make them work for free.
I don't think we're ever going to have a healed country until we address the root of the harm that has been caused in the United States.
We were promised 40 acres and a mule after slavery. Obviously, those promises were broken.
African Americans, Black Americans supported our struggles for justice.
It is about how much pain was inflicted upon thousands of American people who happen to be Japanese in terms of ancestry. But this Black American cries out as loudly as my Asian American brothers and sisters.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Mike. And I'll just address the question that you asked before showing the trailer. And a lot of people don't know that one of the, really most powerful advocates for the reparations for Japanese Americans was Congressman Ron Dellums. And my father and mother were both incarcerated during World War II for being Japanese, received redress and reparations in the late 1980s. And I think the one lesson that I take away from that whole experience of seeing my parents receive their letter of apology from President Bush to receive a reparations check is that that would have never happened without the support of other communities. And I always like to share with people that the Congressional Black Caucus at that time was unanimous in its support of reparations for Japanese Americans. And, you know, quite honestly, they could have easily said, what about me? You know, what about the Black community? But they saw an opportunity to address an injustice and they never wavered. And so where my film really comes from is, you know, really trying to lift up and educate people about this centuries-long struggle for the Black community and the fact that it has never been addressed, that it has been constantly dismissed by Congress to even have a conversation about this particular issue. And so I'm very fortunate to be part of a public education group that is really trying to lift up the injustices that still have yet to be addressed in this country. I was encouraged to take on this particular topic. And of course, you know, I did so with a tremendous amount of humility. And I'm just very fortunate that my work in advocacy in San Francisco gave me the opportunity to know and work with many Black leaders who are involved in the reparations effort. We have a local reparations task force in San Francisco. We also have a reparations task force in California. And so, and I think it's so important that, again, circling back to what I originally said, you know, this would have never happened for Japanese Americans without support from other communities. So I think I'm one of many who are just trying to return that favor and make sure that this issue gets the attention that it deserves.
Excellent, good to hear that. And I'm going to pose another question, but I also want to open it up to questions from our audience too. So we'll start to incorporate that into the conversation. But this is for all of you, just to think in terms of, you know, some of the challenges you might have encountered when trying to present it to the next generation, right? Next generation of younger students who may not be familiar with the history. What are some of those roadblocks like? I know it's not the easiest thing to get new curriculum into the school environment. That must be kind of challenging. I throw that out there to anyone who's got some experience.
Well, so I'll just speak from the standpoint of the issue that my film covers, and that there is unfortunately a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding about the efforts to seek reparations for the Black community. Many want to have created false narratives that it's solely about slavery, and it certainly is, right? It's certainly very central to this whole issue, but really what it's about, and it's covered in my film, is that it's really about all the forms of systemic racism in this country that has perpetuated this racial wealth gap in this country, and that it is not just slavery, but it is all the subsequent forms of very intentional oppression, right, that has maintained a very clear gap between what Black families have accumulated in wealth in this country and what white families have. And so I think it's just really important that we, as we address these things and try to bring them into the classrooms, that we do. I know one of the barriers that I've come across are just that there's so little understanding and frankly a willingness to think openly about a topic such as this.
I can jump in about some of the roadblocks that I faced. And probably the biggest roadblock I faced is that people just don't understand that this even happened, that it's an unknown piece of history, and people are confused that how can there be a period of unknown history? But I think that there are probably lots of unknown pieces of history still to be discovered. But I always try to make the link that these pogroms are now considered a precursor to the Holocaust, because so many of the pogromists, who were young Ukrainians at the time, 20 years later, when the Nazis came into the country, they were asking for help from locals in rounding up Jews. And these pogromists were now in their 30s and 40s, and they were primed to help. And the Holocaust in Ukraine was not a Holocaust of concentration camps. It was shooting, killing people in killing fields and over pits. And the Nazis even said to their commanders back in Berlin, we're surprised at the help that we're getting from local Ukrainian men. And this is now relevant today because Putin's premise for entering Ukraine or invading Ukraine was the denazification of Ukraine. And it's a distortion of what happened during that time, but they're claiming they have to go in and get rid of these Nazis. Well, there aren't Nazis, but there were plenty of Ukrainian pogromists who participated in the Holocaust. And Putin is just reinterpreting history to his benefit now.
And I'll say from an educator perspective, some of the challenges are that as educators, we often teach how we were taught. And the history of the day was steeped in master narratives, right? Those who were focal in history were, and I'll just be blunt and frank, were white men. And so the history of white men is what most teachers themselves was the lens through which they were educated. And that was enough, right? And so what I think is happening right now is a cultural awakening, thank goodness, that we have varied perspectives being brought into the classroom, and our students are hungry for it. Students are not apathetic. Students are extremely empathetic and extremely action-oriented. So what I appreciated about both of the films was this call to action, right? So Reparations talks about what this idea of social justice and what can be done. And in Dear Children, we find the granddaughter talking about her role in fighting against apartheid in South Africa. And that is really, that's what our students want. And quite frankly, it's not enough to just tell our students that they need to be social justice activists or advocates, but to show them that path through illuminating these stories. This is also history. So we have to widen the lens of history. And as educators, we also have to engage in acts of social justice ourselves.
I have to say, every time I do a presentation, I'm overwhelmed with the people who come to me and say, I didn't know, I want to know more. And they really want to do a much deeper dive.
There is one question for Jon from Luis Alvarez Nieto. He said, Jon, you mentioned the Reparations Task Force in California. Can we get more details?
Sure, absolutely. So California is the only state in the nation that has a formal task force to study this issue and to make recommendations for what reparations might look like. And they, in fact, just released a 700-page report on all the findings, not just how this issue pertains to California, but how it pertains to the rest of this country. And I think the hope is that some of you may know that this issue has originally been addressed by trying to pass federal legislation to create a commission to study this issue. And that has been stalled for over 30 years. And so what's happening now is at the local level, this issue is starting to be addressed in communities where they have started to get really significant traction. So California, again, has a Reparations Task Force. San Francisco does. Many other local communities have also created these similar types of commissions to really unpack this issue and to, because a lot of historically, the issue of reparations for the Black community often gets dismissed out of hand because of what I call the whatabouts, right? It's what about, you know, who's eligible, and what about how are we going to pay for this, and what about Oprah Winfrey and, you know, wealthy Black Americans. And it's really been used as a deflection tactic. And so I think the work of these commissions, like in California, are so important to really bring factual information to the forefront so people can understand this issue and make reparations that make sense in trying to address really the many ways in which the Black community has been denied opportunities to accumulate wealth in this country.
Yeah, no, thanks for answering that question. And, you know, to kind of bring back our other panelists in, like, what are things, you know, you were mentioning that the importance in educating our students, the next generation. What are other things we can do to help the students make those connections between groups and history? Because sometimes I feel like history can be overwhelming. You can't teach everything in the classroom. So what are ways that teachers, those in the community, can actually make stronger connections between the different groups, and how can that be applied today?
I think we have to tap into those unheard voices. I think it's really important in those untold stories. So very often, you know, as an educator in 5th grade, students learn about this over, and then they learn about it again in sophomore year, and then they learn it about again in senior year. So they might learn about George Washington 7 times between kindergarten and 12th grade, but they never understand anything about the Taino, who were the native tribe in the Dominican Republic before Christopher Columbus got there. And their story is important. Or they don't learn about Fred Korematsu, or they don't learn about the Chicano movement. So I think it is a matter of opening up these stories, these bits of history to everyone, and allowing students to ask questions and really explore themselves through the stories of others. I think that's really important. I also just want to say this. Part of our issue too is the fear that is being created through policy right now. And I say the fear because the actuality is that some of these policies aren't as stringent and as strict as we think they are. So I think even educating ourselves on what policies look like in different areas so that we can teach truth to power.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Keisha just shared, in that I think we have to be really open and honest about the fact that there is a significant amount of willful amnesia in this country. There are many people who don't want these stories told, who don't want the truth, right, about the history of this country shared with young people, and have created false narratives like the fear being perpetuated around critical race theory in schools right now. And so I think we have to collectively address what is happening in our school boards, right? And the ways that these false narratives are really hampering our opportunity, you know, our ability to share these stories in the classroom. And just the other point I want to make about what Larissa just asked about, I think there are so many examples about ways in which communities have lifted each other up, have supported each other, have been allies to each other. And young people do not know enough of those stories. And I think that leads to too often communities fall back into only advocating for themselves, right, and their issues. And I think we lose power as communities of color when we only advocate for ourselves. And that we, as much as possible, need to lift up and introduce these instances where communities have stood up for each other. And because I think that's the way that we can build power. That's the way in which we can make progress on so many of these issues.
Yeah, sorry. We all suffer when any one group is otherized by another group.
Yeah, no, that's very, very, very true. I want to definitely ask you, starting with LeeAnn and Jon, what has been the impact of the films and the conversations so far, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom?
As I said, whenever I do a screening, I just get overwhelmed with people who they want to tell me their stories, their family stories, and then they want to know more. And how can I find out more? And it always leads. It becomes an opening for them to just learn more about their own families. So I get a lot of older people who want to tell me their personal family stories, but I also get a lot of younger people who are just baffled that this is unknown and how can this be unknown. And I just think it's important that we expose these stories as much as possible. I mean, Keisha, you talked about this. We need to tell these stories. But yeah, I'm always touched by the number of people who approach me and say, I just didn't know, and how distraught they are that they didn't know so much about their own families.
Well, and I'll just share that House Resolution 40, which would create a commission to study the issue of reparations for the Black community at the federal level, was after over 30 years of languishing and being dismissed, was finally moved out of subcommittee just this past April. It received enough votes and currently has about 200 co-sponsors. But I think many who are joining us here today can understand that it really requires an overwhelming number of co-sponsors to bring this issue to the House floor. And so I'm very, pleased that this is a very active live bill, right, that has an opportunity to finally move forward and finally get some traction. And so I encourage audiences that who get a chance to view my film to make sure to check if their congressional representatives have signed on as co-sponsors. If not, to send letters and to find opportunities to speak to staffers of those legislators to try to bolster and get as many co-sponsors as possible. And I think I'm also very pleased to be able to share. So I do want to mention that my colleague from the Stop Repeating History team, which commissioned this film, Don Tamaki, is the only non-Black member who is part of the California Reparations Task Force. And so I think I'm able to share like a real-time live example of how solidarity can work, what it could look like, and really, opportunities where we each can step up for each other, and where it's made a real impact. So I think those are the types of things that I'm very fortunate to be able to share with audiences who are able to view my film.
No, thanks for sharing that. It's definitely a practical application. Keisha, we're talking about some very dark moments in history, and I know that can be very daunting, and we were having this conversation the other day. How do you best kind of prime and set the stage for students? Because it is a very harrowing, I mean, you were mentioning about what happened during the pogroms, or even with slavery and Japanese incarceration. I mean, these are very, very heavy topics.
Yeah, and I can tell you, not even just with students, right? So as I was watching LeeAnn's film and seeing some of the images, like, it was traumatic for me, right? And I think it's really, and even some of the instances of lynching in the Reparations film. And while that is the totality, that is part of history, that's not the totality of history. So as educators, I think it's really important for us to bring the whole range of human emotions and human life into focus as we prepare students to see films like this, pre and post, that we understand that there are moments of joy, there are moments of resistance, there are moments in pain in people's life, and not one of those things define truly the person. So I think about the story of, and I'm going to mispronounce her name, LeeAnn, how do you pronounce her name?
Vega.
Vega. I think of Vega's story, this mother who wants to impart her life's lessons for her children, and having conversations with students that connect to their own family. LeeAnn talked about when she talks to people after her film, they want to make these connections to their own family. And I think children need to see the connections between their own families, but also understand that there is more and that there's stuff that they can do. And that they can be anyone doing this work and building community across different differences. I think it's really important, and that's a lesson for students in the long run.
No, that's definitely very important. LeeAnn, you're going to add to that?
Yeah, I think that what my film shows, and Keisha, you brought this up, the younger generations, Vega's great-grandchildren, were really inspired by her story to take up the social justice mantle. And the Jewish community in general in South Africa were staunch opponents of apartheid and worked very hard against apartheid. And a lot of that was because of what they themselves went through. So I know that Vega's story really resonated with her great-grandchildren, her great-great-grandchildren. And I think so many young people are really hungry for social justice and what can they do? And these stories really are inspiring for many people.
And I think there's a language emerging for it, right? Where it's just such a time as this, there's this language of allyship and accomplices and all of this beautiful language that speaks to how we all come together to combat ills within our society and make one another better. So if the goal of education is to build a better citizenry, what better way than to discuss our past and ways to rectify and repair for the future.
Yes,
absolutely. And LeeAnn and Jon, I mean, I know LeeAnn, you have actually a list of resources and additional materials. Can you share a little bit about some resources for teachers that are available in connection with your film?
Oh, well, I know we prepared one ourselves that can be used as a teaching tool, but I keep on my website a list of resources because it's such a forgotten period of history that whenever something becomes available or somebody publishes something, I try to add to it so that anybody visiting my website has as much of an up-to-date resource list as possible, just because it is so difficult to find materials.
I mentioned it earlier, but the report that was just issued last month, this month, by the California Reparations Task Force really is groundbreaking and is the first of its kind to dive this deeply into this issue. And in a lot of ways, it started the work that an HR 40 commission was meant to do. So I think that for folks who are interested in this issue, it is a daunting document, I'll be honest about that, but it really breaks down the levels of, frankly, atrocities, right, that have been inflicted on the Black community, how it has not been solely about what happened during the slavery period, but all the subsequent decades since, centuries since, of ways in which there's been very intentional ways, right, that the Black community has been kept from accumulating wealth in this country. So I really encourage folks to, if they get a chance to view that, it's easily found online right now, and that report will be the basis for recommendations, which will come out next year.
Yeah, no, thanks. And Keisha just dropped some information in the chat about a great book, Why by Peter Hayes, and another, How Was It Possible by Peter Hayes as well, which we'll share.
I just add another book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGee. I also think really speaks to Jon's point of this idea of when we focus on racial dismantling systemic racism, that a rising tide lifts all boats, that everyone grows and benefits from it. It's a great book.
Yeah, no,
I
thank you
could be
for.
here all day. I'm a teacher.
I know.
could give you a list of books
and
that would-
and Keisha, feel free and an email to me that if any other books or resources you want me to share, I can pass it along to all the attendees today. We are going to open it up for more Q&A. So if you have some questions, please feel free to drop that in the chat. In the meantime, I did want to make a few more announcements before we get to the Q&A. And I think, unfortunately, Mike Mascoll has had some technical difficulties. And so he was originally going to do this announcement. Mike is actually part of our collections team at New Day. And I'm actually trying to find what he was supposed to say, but in case you didn't know, New Day Films, not only can you license individual films, but you can actually license different collections. And we have different life of file licenses for films, which is basically in perpetuity streaming for individual titles. We also have the full collection license, which is a 1 to 3 year license that grants your institution access to the whole New Day streaming catalog. And our subject matter is quite varied, from women's issues, which is very relevant today, all the way to immigration. And this allows you to customize, and it also allows you to customize a collection of films to also receive special discounts through this collections. So feel free to visit our website, newday.com, or even talk to Mike. You kind of saw him earlier, but Mike is your guide to learn more about that. And if you are on social media, please follow us on Facebook, which we are streaming right now live, New Day Films, as well as on Twitter at New Day Films, and on Instagram at New Day Doc Films for other events and exciting announcements about our various films and related topics. And of course, the films featured today are available on New Day. We have Reparations by Jon Osaki, and that is actually going to be screening, and I think this is kind of like a big announcement here, John. It's screening at the Indianapolis Black Film Festival in August. So for more information, visit his website, jjmlproductions.com, and we'll drop a link in the chat for that. And my dear children, please check out that film, as well as the resources on LeeAnn's website. Just a couple more things before we get to the Q&A. If you are a filmmaker and you are considering possibly joining New Day or have a film that you think might fit our collection, our next new filmmaker webinar is July 11th. It's like a little get to know New Day. We're a very unique co-op as opposed to your traditional distribution company. So that's happening July 11th, and you can sign up on our website, newday.com. We'll also drop a link to the Google form here. And lastly, we have a save the date for our next Reframe and Refresh. We are taking a break for July, and we are coming back in August 24th at 2 p.m. on Wednesday. And we have a very special film that will be spotlighting Deej, which is about DJ Savar. I hope I'm not butchering his name. DJ Savarisi is a non-speaking young autistic who dreams of college and communicates via text-to-voice synthesizer and here via Viadoctomy and poetry in collaboration with director Robert Roy, who is a member of New Day Films. So we are going to have this incredible discussion about autism and also about the disability community on August 24th. So we hope you come back and join us then. And so now let's get to our questions from the audience here. Pam, do we have any questions?
I don't see any more questions, but
I do have some here that were emailed in advance, so I will ask those. And for those of you who are attending, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. LeeAnn, and I guess John, you could also answer this. Like, where are some of your subjects today, or some of the people that you interviewed? Because I know you made this film a few years back.
Yeah, and we were talking about this just before we started. So our guide in Ukraine, a man named Alex Denai, is currently missing in Ukraine. He is of fighting age, and he was in constant contact with me up through the first week after the invasion, sending me updates of what was happening. And since then, I have not been able to reach him.
Wow, that gets real. Yeah. John?
Yeah, that's horrible. So I'll just share a couple of folks. So Supervisor Shaman Walton, who's in my film, is currently leading the Reparations Task Force in San Francisco. Also several, including Emily Akpan and others. And I do want to give a shout out to the many individuals throughout the country who have been and continue to be involved in supporting the movement for reparations for the Black community. And she is definitely one of those who are actively leading efforts, engaging people, educating people in this effort. So I think everybody in my film, it continues to beat the drum, try to educate wherever possible, and to make this a conversation that more are included in, and that there are more engaged in this, educating themselves and understanding how they can be involved and be a part in making progress on this issue.
No, well said. And I think maybe an appropriate last question for all of you is, what do you hope people will take away from this conversation today?
For me, it's the importance of not otherizing groups.
And for me, it's important that people understand that we need to build bridges, that we need to coalesce as communities and understand one another and support one another. And it doesn't matter if you look like me, it doesn't matter if you sound like me, it doesn't matter if you have the same sexual preferences I do, it really doesn't matter. That our stories are what's important. I go back to my mother was an advocate of stories, and our stories unite us, our stories make us human, and for the betterment of humanity, we need to build bridges and communities.
And I'll just end with that. I mean, I made this film and I make many of my other films because I believe the best way to make progress in addressing systemic racism in this country is together. And that we have to find ways to build power collectively with each other, to address and confront false narratives that divide us. And really the path forward in addressing so many of these issues, right, is to lift each other up. And, you know, to Keisha's point about a rising tide, I think we have to all be a part of creating the momentum to rise that tide throughout this country.
Mm-hmm.
Well said, well said. I want to thank you all for coming on today and sharing your insights. I want to thank Mike Mascoll as well, who unfortunately had some technical issues, and for everyone attending, thank you for your patience and understanding as we navigate our continued virtual world and the technical issues that come with it. But thank you all for just making these films. Keisha, for being a teacher advocating for so many of these subjects and telling the stories of the others and telling the stories that students don't necessarily get in textbooks today. I see a comment in the chat here that somebody in the UK wants to work on this very topic and finding organizations of people who can collaborate with us to build bridges. And this has been wonderful. And so they said, thank you to the panel. We hope everyone will join us on August 24th for our discussion on the film Deej and the autism community. A happy early 4th of July for those in the UK. I could make a crazy joke about, sorry, we had independence from you, but see now there's solidarity between the UK and the US. So see how far we've come in history. So that's a lesson learned as well. And on behalf of New Day, once again, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.